There were several candidates for all the offices in the gift of the new state of Nevada, save two: United States Senator and Secretary of State. Nye was certain to get a senatorship, and Orion was so sure to get the secretaryship that no one but him was named for that office. But he was hit with one of his spasms of virtue on the very day that the Republican Party was to make its nominations in the convention, and refused to go near the convention. He was urged, but all persuasions failed. He said his presence there would be an unfair and improper influence, and that if he was to be nominated, the compliment must come to him as a free and unspotted gift. This attitude would have settled his case for him without further effort, but he had another attack of virtue on the same day, and made it absolutely sure. It had been his habit for a great many years to change his religion with his shirt, and his ideas about temperance at the same time. He would be a teetotaler for a while, and the champion of the cause. Then he would change to the other side for a time. On nomination day, he suddenly changed from a friendly attitude toward whiskey, which was the popular attitude, to uncompromising teetotalism, and went absolutely dry. His friends besought and implored, but all in vain. He could not be persuaded to cross the threshold of a saloon. The paper next morning contained the list of the chosen nominees. His name was not on it. He had not received a vote. His rich income ceased when the state government came into power. He was without an occupation. Something had to be done. He put up his sign as attorney at law, but he got no clients. It was strange. It was difficult to account for. I cannot account for it. But if I were going to guess at a solution, I should guess that by the make of him he would examine both sides of a case so diligently and so conscientiously that when he got through with his argument, neither he nor a jury would know which side he was on. I think that his client would find out his make in laying his case before him, and would take warning and withdraw it in time to save himself from possible disaster. I had taken up my residence in San Francisco about a year before the time I have just been speaking of. One day I got a tip from Mr. Camp, a bold man who was always making big fortunes in ingenious speculations, and losing them again in the course of 6 months by other speculative ingenuities. Camp told me to buy some shares in the Hale and Norcross. I bought 50 shares at $300 a share. I bought on a margin and put up 20%. It exhausted my funds. I wrote Orion and offered him half, and asked him to send his share of the money. I waited and waited. He wrote and said he was going to attend to it. The stock went up pretty briskly. It went higher and higher. It reached $1,000 a share. It climbed to $2,000, then to $3,000, then to twice that figure. The money did not come, but I was not disturbed. By and by, that stock took a turn and began to gallop down. Then I wrote urgently. Orion answered that he had sent the money long ago, said he had sent it to the Occidental Hotel. I inquired for it. They said it was not there. To cut a long story short, that stock went on down until it fell below the price I had paid for it. Then it began to eat up the margin, and when at last I got out, I was very badly crippled. When it was too late, I found out what had become of Orion's money. Any other human being would have sent a check, but he sent gold. The hotel clerk put it in the safe and went on vacation, and there it had reposed all this time, enjoying its fatal work, no doubt. Another man might have thought to tell me that the money was not in a letter, but was in an express package, but it never occurred to Orion to do that. Later, Mr. Camp gave me another chance. He agreed to buy our Tennessee land for $200,000, pay a part of the amount in cash, and give long notes for the rest. His scheme was to import foreigners from grape-growing and wine-making districts in Europe, settle them on the land, and turn it into a wine-growing country. He knew what Mr. Longworth thought of those Tennessee grapes and was satisfied. I sent the contracts and things to Orion for his signature, he being one of the three heirs. But they arrived at a bad time, in a doubly bad time, in fact. The temperance virtue was temporarily upon him in strong force, and he wrote and said that he would not be a party to debauching the country with wine. Also, he said how could he know whether Mr. Camp was going to deal fairly and honestly with those poor people from Europe or not. And so, without waiting to find out, he quashed the whole trade, and there it fell, never to be brought to life again. The land, from being suddenly worth $200,000, became as suddenly worth what it was before, nothing, and taxes to pay. I had paid the taxes and the other expenses for some years, but I dropped the Tennessee land there and have never taken any interest in it since, pecuniarily or otherwise, until yesterday. I had supposed until yesterday that Orion had frittered away the last acre, and indeed that was his own impression. But a gentleman arrived yesterday from Tennessee and brought a map showing that by a correction of the ancient surveys we still own 1,000 acres in a coal district out of the 100,000 acres which my father left us when he died in 1847. The gentleman brought a proposition. Also, he brought a reputable and well-to-do citizen of New York. The proposition was that the Tennessean gentleman should sell that land, that the New York gentleman should pay all the expenses and fight all the lawsuits in case any should turn up, and that of such profit as might eventuate, the Tennessean gentleman should take a third, the New Yorker a third, and Sam Moffett and his sister and I, who are the surviving heirs, the remaining third. This time, I hope we shall get rid of the Tennessee land for good and all, and never hear of it again. I came east in January 1867. Orion remained in Carson City perhaps a year longer. Then he sold his $12,000 house and its furniture for $3,500 in greenbacks at about 60% discount. He and his wife took passage in the steamer for home in Keokuk. About 1871 or 72, they came to New York. Orion had been trying to make a living in the law ever since he had arrived from the Pacific coast, but he had secured only 2 cases. Those he was to try free of charge, but the possible result will never be known, because the parties settled the cases out of court without his help. Orion got a job as a proofreader on the New York Evening Post at $10 a week. By and by, he came to Hartford and wanted me to get him a place as reporter on a Hartford paper. Here was a chance to try my scheme again, and I did it. I made him go to the Hartford Evening Post without any letter of introduction, and proposed to scrub and sweep and do all sorts of things for nothing, on the plea that he didn't need money but only needed work, and that was what he was pining for. Within six weeks, he was on the editorial staff of that paper at $20 a week, and he was worth the money. He was presently called for by some other paper at better wages, but I made him go to the Post people and tell them about it. They stood the raise and kept him. It was the pleasantest berth he had ever had in his life. It was an easy berth. He was in every way comfortable, but ill luck came. It was bound to come. A new Republican daily was to be started in a New England city by a stock company of well-to-do politicians, and they offered him the chief editorship at $3,000 a year. He was eager to accept. My beseechings and reasonings went nothing went for nothing. I said, "You are as weak as water. Those people will find it out right away. They will easily see that you have no backbone, that they can deal with you as they would deal with a slave. You may last 6 months, but not longer. Then they will not dismiss you as they would dismiss a gentleman. They will fling you out as they would fling out an intruding tramp." It happened just so. Then he and his wife migrated to Keokuk once more. Orion wrote from there that he was not resuming the law, that he thought that what his wealth needed was the open air, in some sort of outdoor occupation, that his father-in-law had a strip of ground on the river border, a mile above Keokuk, with some sort of a house on it. And his idea was to buy that place and start a chicken farm and provide Keokuk with chickens and eggs, and perhaps butter. But I don't know whether you can raise butter on a chicken farm or not. He said the place could be had for $3,000 cash, and I sent the money. He began to raise chickens, and he made a detailed monthly report to me, whereby it appeared that he was able to work off his chickens on the Keokuk people at $1.25 a pair. But it also appeared that it cost $1.60 to raise the pair. This did not seem to discourage Orion, and so I let it go. Meanwhile, he was borrowing $100 per month of me, regularly, month by month. Now, to show Orion's stern and rigid business ways, and he really prided himself on his large business capacities, the moment he had received the advance of $100 at the beginning of each month, he always sent me his note for the amount, and with it he sent, out of that money, 3 months' interest on the $100 at 6% per annum, these notes being always for 3 months. As I say, he always sent a detailed statement of the month's profit and loss on the chickens, at least the month's loss on the chickens, and this detailed statement included the various items of expense, corn for the chickens, boots for himself, and so on, even car fares and the weekly contribution of 10 cents to help out the missionaries who were trying to damn the Chinese after a plan not satisfactory to those people. I think the poultry experiment lasted about a year, possibly 2 years. It had then cost me $6,000. Orion returned to the law business, and I suppose he remained in that harness off and on for the succeeding quarter of a century. But so far as my knowledge goes, he was only a lawyer in name, and he had no clients. My mother died in her 88th year, in the summer of 1890. She had saved some money, and she left it to me, because it had come from me. I gave it to Orion, and he said, with thanks, that I had supported him long enough, and now he was going to relieve me of the burden, and would also hope to pay back some of that expense, and maybe the whole of it. Accordingly, he proceeded to use up that money in building a considerable addition to the house, with the idea of taking boarders and getting rich. We need not dwell upon this venture. It was another of his failures. His wife tried hard to make the scheme succeed, and if anybody could have made it succeed, she would have done it. She was a good woman and was greatly liked. She had a practical side, and she would have made that boarding house lucrative if circumstances had not been against her. Orion had other projects for recouping me, but they always required capital. I stayed out of them, and they did not materialize. Once he wanted to start a newspaper. It was a ghastly idea, and I squelched it with a promptness that was almost rude. Then he invented a wood sawing machine and patched it together himself, and he really sawed wood with it. It was ingenious, it was capable, and it would have made a comfortable little fortune for him, but just at the wrong time Providence interfered again. Orion applied for a patent and found that the same machine had already been patented and had gone into business and was thriving. Presently, The state of New York offered a $50,000 prize for a practical method of navigating the Erie Canal with steam canal boats. Orion worked at that thing for 2 or 3 years, invented and completed a method, and was once more ready to reach out and seize upon imminent wealth when somebody pointed out a defect. His steam canal boat could not be used in the wintertime, and in the summertime the commotion its wheels would make in the water would wash away the state of New York on both sides. Innumerable were Orion's projects for acquiring the means to pay off the debt to me. These projects extended straight through the succeeding 30 years, but in every case they failed. During all those 30 years, his well-established honesty kept him in offices of trust, where other people's money had to be taken care of, but where no salary was paid. He was treasurer of all the benevolent institutions. He took care of the money and other property of widows and orphans. He never lost a cent for anybody, and never made one for himself. Every time he changed his religion, the church of his new faith was glad to get him, made him treasurer at once, and at once he stopped the graft and leaks in that church. He exhibited a facility in changing his political complexion that was a marvel to the whole community. Once the following curious thing happened, and he wrote me all about it himself. One morning he was a Republican, and upon invitation he agreed to make a campaign speech at the Republican mass meeting that night. He prepared the speech. After luncheon he became a Democrat, and agreed to write a score of exciting mottos to be painted upon the transparencies which the Democrats would carry in their torchlight procession that night. He wrote these shouting Democratic mottos during the afternoon, and they occupied so much of his time that it was night before he had a chance to change his politics again. So he actually made a rousing Republican campaign speech in the open air while his Democratic transparencies passed by in front of him, to the joy of every witness present. He was a most strange creature, but in spite of his eccentricities he was beloved, all his life in whatsoever community he lived. And he was also held in high esteem, for at bottom he was a sterling man. About 25 years ago, along there somewhere, I suggested to Orion that he write an autobiography. I asked him to try to tell the straight truth in it, to refrain from exhibiting himself in creditable attitudes exclusively, and to honorably set down all the incidences of his life which he had found interesting to him, including those which were burned into his memory because he was ashamed of them. I said that this had never been done, and that if he could do it, his autobiography would be a most valuable piece of literature. I said I was offering him a job which I could not duplicate in my own case, but I would cherish the hope that he might succeed with it. I recognize now that I was trying to saddle upon him an impossibility. I have been dictating this autobiography of mine daily for 3 months. I have thought of 1,500 or 2,000 incidents in my life which I am ashamed of, but I have not gotten around to one of them to consent to go on paper yet. I think that stock will still be complete and unimpaired when I finish these memoirs, if I ever finish them. I believe that if I should put in all or any of those incidents, I should be sure to strike them out when I came to revise this book. Orion wrote his autobiography and sent it to me, but great was my disappointment, and my vexation too. In it, he was constantly making a hero of himself, exactly as I should have done and am doing now, and he was constantly forgetting to put in the episodes which placed him in an unheroic light. I knew several incidents of his life which were distinctly and painfully unheroic, but when I came across them in his autobiography, they had changed color. They had turned themselves inside out and were things to be intemperately proud of. In my dissatisfaction, I destroyed a considerable part of that autobiography, but in what remains there are passages which are interesting, and I shall quote from them here and there, and now and then as I go along. While we were living in Vienna in 1898, a cablegram came from Keokuk announcing Orion's death. He was 72 years old. He had gone down to the kitchen in the early hours of a bitter December morning. He had built a fire, and had then sat down at a table to write something, and there he died, with a pencil in his hand, and resting against the paper in the middle of an unfinished word. An indication that his release from the captivity of a long and troubled and pathetic and unprofitable life was mercifully swift and painless. Dictated in 1904. A quarter of a century ago, I was visiting John Hay and Whitelaw Reid's house in New York, which Hay was occupying for a few months while Reid was absent on a holiday in Europe. Temporarily also, Hay was editing Reid's paper, the New York Tribune. I remember 2 incidents of that Sunday visit particularly well. I had known John Hay a good many years. I had known him when he was an obscure young editorial writer on the Tribune in Horace Greeley's time, earning 3 or 4 times the salary he got. Considering the high character of the work which came from his pen. In those early days, he was a picture to look at, for beauty of feature, perfection of form, and grace of carriage and movement. He had a charm about him of a sort quite unusual to my Western ignorance and inexperience, a charm of manner, intonation, apparently native and unstudied elocution, and all that, the groundwork of it, native, the ease of it, the polish of it, the winning naturalness of it, acquired in Europe, where he had been charge d'affaires some time at the court of Vienna. He was joyous and cordial, a most pleasant comrade. One of the 2 incidents above referred to as marking that visit was this. In trading remarks concerning our ages, I confessed to 42 and Hay to 40. Then he asked if I had begun to write my autobiography, and I said I hadn't. He said that I ought to begin at once, and that I had already lost 2 years. Then he said in substance this. At 40, a man reaches the top of the hill of life and starts down on the sunset side. The ordinary man, the average man, not to particularize too closely and say the commonplace man, has at that age succeeded or failed. In either case, he has lived all of his life that is likely to be worth recording. Also, in either case, the life lived is worth setting down, and cannot fail to be interesting if he comes as near to telling the truth about himself as he can. And he will tell the truth in spite of himself, for his facts and his fictions will work loyally together for the protection of the reader. Each fact and each fiction will be a dab of paint. Each will fall in its right place, and together they will paint his portrait, not the portrait he thinks they are painting, but his real portrait, the inside of him, the soul of him. His character. Without intending to lie, he will lie all the time, not bluntly, consciously, not dully, unconsciously, but half-consciously. Consciousness in twilight, a soft and gentle and merciful twilight, which makes his general form comely, with his virtuous prominences and projections discernible, and his ungracious ones in shadow. His truths will be recognizable as truths. His modifications of facts, which would tell against him, will go for nothing. The reader will see the fact through the film and know his man. There is a subtle devilish something or other about autobiographical composition that defeats all the writer's attempts to paint his portrait his way. Hay meant that he and I were ordinary, average, commonplace people, and I did not resent my share of the verdict, but nursed my wound in silence. His idea that we had finished our work in life, passed the summit, and were westward bound downhill, with me 2 years ahead of him, and neither of us with anything further to do as benefactors to mankind, was all a mistake. I had written 4 books then, possibly 5. I have been drowning the world in literary wisdom ever since, volume after volume. Since that day's sun went down, he has been the historian of Mr. Lincoln, and his book will never perish. He has been ambassador, brilliant orator, competent and admirable Secretary of State. As I have said, that vast plot of Tennessee land was held by my father 20 years intact. When he died in 1847, we began to manage it ourselves. 40 years afterward, we had managed it all away except 10,000 acres, and gotten nothing to remember the sales by. About 1887, possibly it was earlier, the 10,000 went. My brother found a chance to trade it for a house and lot in the town of Corey, in the oil regions of Pennsylvania. About 1894, he sold this property for $250. That ended the Tennessee land. If any penny of cash ever came out of my father's wise investment, but that I have no recollection of it, no, I am overlooking a detail. It furnished me a field for cellars and a book. Out of my half of the book, I got $15,000 or $20,000. Out of the play, I got $75,000 or $80,000, just about $1 an acre. It is curious. I was not alive when my father made the investment. Therefore, he was not intending any partiality. Yet, I was the only member of the family that ever profited by it. I shall have occasion to mention this land again, now and then, as I go along, for it influenced our life in one way or another during more than a generation. Whenever things grew dark, it rose and put out its hopeful seller's hand and cheered us up, and said, "Do not be afraid, trust in me, wait." It kept us hoping and hoping during 40 years, and forsook us at last. It put our energies to sleep and made visionaries of us, dreamers and indolent. We were always going to be rich next year, no occasion to work. It is good to begin life poor. It is good to begin life rich. These are wholesome. But to begin it prospectively rich, the man who has not experienced it cannot imagine the curse of it. My parents removed to Missouri in the early 30s. I do not remember just when, for I was not born then, and cared nothing for such things. It was a long journey in those days, and must have been a rough and tiresome one. The home was made in the wee village of Florida in Monroe County, and I was born there in 1835. The village contained 100 people, and I increased the population by 1%. It is more than the best man in history ever did for any other town. It may not be modest in me to refer to this, but it is true. There is no record of a person doing as much, not even Shakespeare. But I did it for Florida, and it shows that I could have done it for any place, even London, I suppose. Recently, someone in Missouri has sent me a picture of the house I was born in. Heretofore, I have always stated that it was a palace, but I shall be more guarded now. I remember only one circumstance connected with my life in it. I remember it very well, though I was but 2.5 years old at the time. The family packed up everything and started in wagons for Hannibal, on the Mississippi, 30 miles away. Toward night, when they camped and counted up the children, one was missing. I was the one. I had been left behind. Parents ought always to count the children before they start. I was having a good enough time playing by myself until I found that the doors were fastened, and that there was a grisly deep silence brooding over the place. I knew then that the family were gone, and that they had forgotten me. I was well frightened, and I made all the noise I could, but no one was near, and it did no good. I spent the afternoon in captivity, and was not rescued until the gloaming had fallen, and the place was alive with ghosts. My brother Henry was 6 months old at the time. I used to remember his walking into a fire outdoors when he was a week old. It was remarkable in me to remember a thing like that, which occurred when I was so young, and it was still more remarkable that I should cling to the delusion, for 30 years, that I did remember it. For of course it never happened. He would not have been able to walk at that age. If I had stopped to reflect, I should not have burdened my memory with that impossible rubbish so long. It is believed by many people that an impression deposited in a child's memory within the first 2 years of his life cannot remain there 5 years. But that is an error. The incidents of Benvenuto Cellini and the salamander must be accepted as authentic and trustworthy. And then that remarkable and indisputable instance in the experience of Helen Keller. However, I will speak of that at another time. For many years I believed that I remembered helping my grandfather drink his whiskey toddy when I was 6 weeks old, but I do not tell about that anymore now. I am grown old, and my memory is not as active as it used to be. When I was younger, I could remember anything, whether it had happened or not, but my faculties are decaying now, and soon I shall be so I cannot remember any but the things that happened. It is sad to go to pieces like this, but we all have to do it. My uncle, John A. Quarles, was a farmer, and his place was in the country 4 miles from Florida. He had 8 children and 15 or 20 Negroes, and was also fortunate in other ways, particularly in his character. I have not come across a better man than he was. I was his guest for 2 or 3 months every year, from the 4th year after we moved to Hannibal till I was 11 or 12 years old. I have never consciously used him or his wife in a book, but his farm has come very handy to me in literature once or twice. In Huck Finn and in Tom Sawyer Detective, I moved it down to Arkansas. It was all of 600 miles, but it was no trouble. It was not a very large farm, 500 acres perhaps, but I could have done it if it had been twice as large. And as for the morality of it, I cared nothing for that. I would move a state if the exigencies of literature required it. It was a heavenly place for a boy, that farm of my Uncle John's. The house was a double log one with a spacious floor, roofed in, connecting it with the kitchen. In the summer, the table was set in the middle of that shady and breezy floor, and the sumptuous meals, well, it makes me cry to think of them. Fried chicken, roast pig, wild and tame turkeys, ducks and geese, venison just killed, squirrels, rabbits, pheasants, partridges, prairie chickens, biscuits, hot batter cakes, hot buckwheat cakes, hot wheat bread, hot rolls, hot corn pone, fresh corn boiled on the ear, succotash, butter beans, string beans, tomatoes, peas, Irish potatoes, sweet potatoes, buttermilk, sweet milk, clabber, watermelons, muskmelons, cantaloupes, all fresh from the garden, apple pie, peach pie, pumpkin pie, apple dumplings, peach cobbler. I can't remember the rest. The way that the things were cooked was perhaps the main splendor, particularly a certain few of the dishes. For instance, the cornbread, the hot biscuits and wheat bread, and the fried chicken. These things have never been properly cooked in the North. In fact, no one there is able to learn the art, so far as my experience goes. The North thinks it knows how to make cornbread, but this is gross superstition. Perhaps no bread in the world is quite as good as Southern cornbread, and perhaps no bread in the world is quite so bad as the Northern imitation of it. The North seldom tries to fry chicken, and this is well. The art cannot be learned north of the Mason and Dixon, nor anywhere in Europe. This is not hearsay, it is experience that is speaking. In Europe, it is imagined that the custom of serving various kinds of bread blazing hot is American, but that is too broad a spread. It is custom in the South, but it is much less than that in the North. In the North and in Europe, hot bread is considered unhealthy. This is probably another fussy superstition, like the European superstition that ice water is unhealthy. Europe does not need ice water and does not drink it, and yet, notwithstanding this, its word for it is better than ours because it describes it where ours doesn't. Europe calls it iced water. Our word describes water made from melted ice, a drink which we have but little acquaintance with. It seems a pity that the world should throw away so many good things merely because they are unwholesome. I doubt if God has given us any refreshment which, taken in moderation, is unwholesome, except microbes. Yet there are people who strictly deprive themselves of each and every eatable, drinkable, and smokable which has in any way acquired a shady reputation. They pay this price for health, and health is all they get for it. How strange it is. It is like paying out your whole fortune for a cow that has gone dry. The farmhouse stood in the middle of a very large yard, and the yard was fenced on 3 sides with rails, and on the rear side with high palings. Against these stood the smokehouse. Beyond the palings was the orchard. Beyond the orchard were the Negro quarter and the tobacco fields. The front yard was entered over a stile made of sawed-off logs of graduated heights. I do not remember any gate. In a corner of the front yard were a dozen lofty hickory trees and a dozen black walnuts, and in the nutting season riches were to be gathered there. Down a piece, abreast of the house, stood a little log cabin against the rail fence, and there the woody hill fell sharply away past the barns, the corn crib, the stables, and the tobacco curing house, to a limpid brook which sang along over its gravelly bed and curved and frisked in and out and here and there and yonder in the deep shade of overhanging foliage and vines. A divine place for wading, and it had swimming pools too, which were forbidden to us and therefore much frequented by us, for we were little Christian children and had early been taught the value of forbidden fruit. In the little log cabin lived a bedridden, white-haired slave woman, whom we visited daily and looked upon with awe, for we believed she was upwards of 1,000 years old and had talked with Moses. The younger Negroes credited these statistics and had furnished them to us in good faith. We accommodated all the details which came to us about her, and so we believed that she had lost her health in the long desert trip coming out of Egypt, and had never been able to get it back again. She had a round, bald place on the crown of her head, and we used to creep around and gaze at it in reverent silence, and reflect that it was caused by fright through seeing Pharaoh drowned. We called her Aunt Hannah, Southern fashion. She was superstitious like the other Negroes. Also, like them, she was deeply religious. Like them, she had great faith in prayer, and employed it in all ordinary exigencies, but not in cases where a dead certainty of result was urgent. Whenever witches were around, she tied up the remnants of her wool in little tufts with white thread, and this promptly made the witches impotent. All the Negroes were friends of ours, and with those of our own age, we were in effect comrades. I say in effect, using the phrase as a modification. We were comrades, and yet not comrades. Color and condition interposed a subtle line which both parties were conscious of, and which rendered complete fusion impossible. We had a faithful and affectionate good friend, ally, and adviser in Uncle Dan'l, a middle-aged slave whose head was the best one in the Negro quarter, whose sympathies were wide and warm, and whose heart was honest and simple and knew no guile. He had served me well these many, many years. I have not seen him for more than half a century, and yet, spiritually, I have had his welcome company a good part of that time, and have staged him in books under his own name and as Jim, and carted him all around to Hannibal, down the Mississippi on a raft, and even across the desert of Sahara in a balloon. And he has endured it all with the patience and friendliness and loyalty which were his birthright. It was on the farm that I got my strong liking for his race and my appreciation of certain of its fine qualities. This feeling and this estimate have stood the test of 60 years and more, and have suffered no impairment. The black face is as welcome to me now as it was then. In my schoolboy days, I had no aversion to slavery. I was not aware that there was anything wrong about it. No one arraigned it in my hearing. The local papers said nothing against it. The local pulpit taught us that God had approved it, that it was a holy thing, and that the doubter need only look in the Bible if he wished to settle his mind. And then the texts were read aloud to us to make the matter sure. If the slaves themselves had an aversion to slavery, they were wise and said nothing. In Hannibal, we seldom saw a slave misused. On the farm, never. There was, however, one small incident of my boyhood days which touched this matter, and it must have meant a good deal to me, or it would not have stayed in my memory, clear and sharp, vivid and shadowless, all these slow drifting years. We had a little slave boy whom we had hired from someone there in Hannibal. He was from the eastern shore of Maryland, and had been brought away from his family and friends, halfway across the American continent, and sold. He was a cheery spirit, innocent and gentle, and the noisiest creature that ever was, perhaps. All day long he was singing, whistling, yelling, whooping, and laughing. It was maddening, devastating, unendurable. At last, one day, I lost all my temper and went raging to my mother, said Sandy had been singing for an hour without a single break, and I couldn't stand it, and wouldn't she please shut him up? The tears came into her eyes, and her lip trembled, and she said something like this: "Poor thing, when he sings, it shows that he is not remembering, and that comforts me. But when he is still, I am afraid he is thinking, and I cannot bear it. He will never see his mother again. If he can sing, I must not hinder it, but be thankful for it. If you were older, you would understand me. Then that friendless child's noise would make you glad." It was a simple speech, and made up of small words, but it went home, and Sandy's noise was not a trouble to me any more. She never used large words, but she had a natural gift for making small ones do effective work. She lived to reach the neighborhood of 90 years, and was capable with her tongue to the last, especially when a meanness or an injustice aroused her spirit. She has come handy to me several times in my books, where she figures as Tom Sawyer's Aunt Polly. I fitted her out with a dialect, and tried to think up other improvement for her, but did not find any. I used Sandy once, also. It was in Tom Sawyer. I tried to get him to whitewash the fence, but it did not work. I do not remember what name I called him by in the book. I can see the farm yet, with perfect clearness. I can see all its belongings, all its details, the family room of the house, with a trundle bed in one corner and a spinning wheel in another, a wheel whose rising and falling wail, heard from a distance, was the mournfulest of all sounds to me, and made me homesick and low-spirited, and filled my atmosphere with the wandering spirits of the dead. The vast fireplace, piled high on winter nights, with flaming hickory logs from whose ends a sugary sap bubbled out but did not go to waste, for we scraped it off and ate it. The lazy cat spread out on the rough hearthstones, the drowsy dogs braced against the jambs and blinking, my aunt in one chimney corner knitting, my uncle in the other smoking his corncob pipe, the slick and carpetless oak floor faintly mirroring the dancing flame tongues and freckled with black indentations where fire coals had popped out and died a leisurely death. Half a dozen children romping in the background twilight, split-bottom chairs here and there, some with rockers, a cradle out of service but waiting with confidence in the early cold mornings of a snuggle of children, in shirts and chemises occupying the hearthstone and procrastinating. They could not bear to leave that comfortable place and go out of the wind-swept floor space between the house and kitchen where the general tin basin stood, and wash. Along outside of the front fence ran the country road, dusty in the summertime and a good place for snakes. They liked to lie in it and sun themselves. When they were rattlesnakes or puff adders, we killed them. When they were black snakes or racers or belonged to the fabled hoop breed, we fled without shame. When they were house snakes or garters, we carried them home and put them in Aunt Patsy's work basket for a surprise, for she was prejudiced against snakes, and always when she took the basket in her lap and they began to climb out of it, it disordered her mind. She never could seem to get used to them. Her opportunities went for nothing, and she was always cold toward bats, too, and could not bear them, and yet I think a bat is as friendly a bird as there is. My mother was Aunt Patsy's sister, and had the same wild superstitions. A bat is beautifully soft and silky. I do not know any creature that is pleasanter to the touch, or is more grateful for caressings, if offered in the right spirit. I know all about these Coleoptera, because our great cave 3 miles below Hannibal was multitudinously stocked with them, and often I brought them home to amuse my mother with. It was easy to manage if it was a school day, because then I had ostensibly been to school and hadn't any bats. But she was not a suspicious person, but full of trust and confidence, and when I said, "There's something in my coat pocket for you," she would put her hand in, but she always took it out again herself. I didn't have to tell her. It was remarkable the way she couldn't learn to like private bats. I think she was never in the cave in her life, but everyone else went there. Many excursion parties came from considerable distances up and down the river to visit the cave. It was miles in extent, and was a tangled wilderness of narrow and lofty clefts and passages. It was an easy place to get lost in. Anybody could do it, including the bats. I got lost in it myself, along with a lady, and our last candle burned down to almost nothing before we glimpsed the search party's lights winding about in the distance. Injun Joe, the half-breed, got lost in there once, and would have starved to death if the bats had run short, but there was no chance of that. There were myriads of them. He told me all his story in the book called Tom Sawyer. I starved him entirely to death in the cave, but that was in the interest of art. It never happened. General Gaines, who was our first town drunkard before Jimmy Finn got the place, was lost in there for the space of a week, and finally pushed his handkerchief out of a hole in a hilltop near Saverton, several miles down the river from the cave's mouth, and somebody saw it and dug him out. There is nothing the matter with his statistics except the handkerchief. I knew him for years, and he hadn't any. But it could have been his nose. That would attract attention. Beyond the road, where the snakes sunned themselves, was a dense young thicket, and through it a dim-lighted path that led a quarter of a mile. Then, out of the dimness, one emerged abruptly upon a great level prairie, which was covered with wild strawberry plants, vividly starred with prairie pinks and walled in on all sides by forests. The strawberries were fragrant and fine, and in the season we were generally there in the crisp freshness of the early morning, while the dew beads still sparkled upon the grass and the woods were ringing with the first songs of the birds. Down the forest slopes to the left were the swings. They were made of bark stripped from hickory saplings. When they became dry, they were dangerous. They usually broke when a child was 40 feet in the air, and this was why so many bones had to be mended every year. I had no ill luck myself, but none of my cousins escaped. There were 8 of them, and at one time and another they broke 14 arms among them. But it cost next to nothing, for the doctor worked by the year, $25 for the whole family. I remember 2 of the Florida doctors, Chowning and Meredith. They not only tended an entire family for $25 a year, but furnished the medicines themselves. Good measure, too. Only the largest persons could hold a whole dose. Castor oil was the principal beverage. The dose was half a dipperful, with half a dipperful of New Orleans molasses added to help it down and make it taste good, which it never did. The next standby was calomel, the next rhubarb, and the next jalap. Then they bled the patient and put mustard plasters on him. It was a dreadful system, and yet the death rate was not heavy. The calomel was nearly sure to salivate the patient and cost him some of his teeth. There were no dentists. When teeth became touched with decay or were otherwise ailing, the doctor knew of but one thing to do. He fetched his tongs and dragged them out. If the jaw remained, it was not his fault. Doctors were not called in cases of ordinary illness. The family's grandmother attended to those. Every old woman was a doctor and gathered her own medicines in the woods and knew how to compound doses that would stir the vitals of a cast-iron dog. And then there was the Indian doctor, a grave savage, remnant of his tribe, deeply read in the mysteries of nature and the secret properties of herbs, and most backwoodsmen had high faith in his powers and could tell of wonderful cures achieved by him. In Mauritius, away off yonder in the solitudes of the Indian Ocean, there is a person who answers to our Indian doctor of the old times. He is a Negro and has had no teaching as a doctor, yet there is one disease which he is master of and can cure, and the doctors can't. They send for him when they have a cause. It is a child's disease of a strange and deadly sort, and the Negro cures it with a herb medicine which he makes himself, from a prescription which has come down to him from his father and grandfather. He will not let anyone see it. He keeps the secret of its components to himself, and it is feared that he will die without divulging it. Then there will be consternation in Mauritius. I was told these things by the people there in 1896. We had the faith doctor, too, in those early days, a woman. Her specialty was toothache. She was a farmer's old wife and lived 5 miles from Hannibal. She would lay her hand on the patient's jaw and say, "Believe," and the cure was prompt. Mrs. Utterback, I remember her very well. Twice I rode out there behind my mother, horseback, and saw the cure performed. My mother was the patient. Dr. Meredith removed to Hannibal by and by, and was our family physician there, and saved my life several times. Still, he was a good man and meant well. Let it go. I was always told that I was a sickly and precarious and tiresome and uncertain child, and lived mainly on allopathic medicines during the first 7 years of my life. I asked my mother about this in her old age. She was in her 88th year, and said, "I suppose during all that time you were uneasy about me?" "Yes, the whole time." "Afraid I wouldn't live?" After a reflective pause, ostensibly to think out the facts. "No, afraid you would." It sounds like a plagiarism, but it probably wasn't. The country schoolhouse was 3 miles from my uncle's farm. It stood in a clearing in the woods and would hold about 25 boys and girls. We attended the school with more or less regularity, once or twice a week in summer, walking to it in the cool of morning by the forest path and back in the gloaming at the end of the day. All the pupils brought their dinners in baskets, corn dodger, buttermilk, and other good things, and sat in the shade of the trees at noon and ate them. It is the part of my education which I look back upon with the most satisfaction. My first visit to the school was when I was 7. A strapping girl of 15 in the customary sunbonnet and calico dress asked me if I used tobacco, meaning did I chew it. I said no. It roused her scorn. She reported me to all the crowd and said, "Here's a boy 7 years old who can't chew tobacco." By the looks and comments which this produced, I realized that I was a degraded object. I was cruelly ashamed of myself. I determined to reform, but I only made myself sick. I was not able to learn to chew tobacco. I learned to smoke it fairly well, but that did not conciliate anybody, and I remained a poor thing and characterless. I longed to be respected, but I was never able to rise. Children have but little charity for each other's defects. As I have said, I spent some part of every year at the farm until I was 12 or 13 years old. The life which I had led there with my cousins was full of charm, and so is the memory of it yet. I can call back the solemn twilight and mystery of the deep woods, the earthy smells, the faint odors of the wild flowers, the sheen of rain-washed foliage, the rattling clatter of drops when the wind shook the trees, the far-off hammering of the woodpeckers and the muffled drumming of the wood pheasants in the remoteness of the forest, the snapshot glimpses of disturbed wild creatures scurrying through the grass. I can call it all back and make it as real as it ever was, and as blessed. I can call back the prairie and its loneliness and peace, and a vast hawk hanging motionless in the sky with its wings spread wide and the blue of the vault showing through the fringe of their end feathers. I can see the woods in their autumn dress, the oaks purple, the hickories washed with cold, the maples and the sumacs luminous with crimson fires. I can hear the rustle made by the fallen leaves as we plowed through them. I can see the blue clusters of wild grapes hanging amongst the foliage of the saplings, and I remember the taste of them and the smell. I know how the wild blackberries looked and how they tasted, and the same with the pawpaws, the hazelnuts, and the persimmons, and I can feel the thumping rain upon my head of hickory nuts and walnuts when we were out in the frosty dawn to scramble for them with the pigs, and the gusts of wind loosed them and sent them down. I know the stain of blackberries and how pretty it is, and I know the stain of walnut hulls and how little it minds soap and water, also what grudged experiences it had of either of them. I know the taste of maple sap and when to gather it, and how to arrange the troughs and the delivery tubes, and how to boil down the juice, and how to hook the sugar after it is made. Also how much better hooked sugar tastes than any that is honestly come by. Let bigots say what they will, I know how a prize watermelon looks when it is sunning its fat rotundity among pumpkin vines and cymblins. I know how to tell when it is ripe without plugging it. I know how inviting it looks when it is cooling itself in a tub of water under the bed, waiting. I know how it looks when it lies on the table in the sheltered great floor space between house and kitchen, and the children gathered for the sacrifice and their mouths watering. I know the crackling sound it makes when the carving knife enters its end, and I can see the split fly along in front of the blade as the knife cleaves its way to the other end. I can see its halves fall apart and display the rich red meat and the black seeds and the heart standing up, a luxury fit for the elect. I know how a boy looks behind a yard-long slice of that melon, and I know how he feels, for I have been there. I know the taste of the watermelon which has been honestly come by, and I know the taste of the watermelon which has been acquired by art. Both taste good, but the experienced know which tastes best. I know the look of green apples and peaches and pears on the trees, and I know how entertaining they are when they are inside of a person. I know how ripe ones look when they are piled in pyramids under the trees, and how pretty they are and how vivid their colors. I know how a frozen apple looks in a barrel down cellar in the wintertime, and how hard it is to bite, and how the frost makes the teeth ache, and yet how good it is, notwithstanding. I know the disposition of elderly people to select the speckled apples for the children, and I once knew ways to beat the game. I know the look of an apple that is roasting and sizzling on a hearth on a winter's evening, and I know the comfort that comes of eating it hot, along with some sugar and a drench of cream. I know the delicate art and mystery of so cracking hickory nuts and walnuts on a flat iron with a hammer that the kernels will be delivered whole, and I know how the nuts, taken in conjunction with winter apples, cider, and doughnuts, make old people's tales and old jokes sound fresh and crisp and enchanting, and juggle an evening away before you know what went with the time. I know the look of Uncle Daniel's kitchen as it was on privileged nights when I was a child, and I can see the white and black children grouped on the hearth with the firelight playing on their faces and the shadows flickering upon the walls, clear back toward the cavernous gloom of the rear. And I can hear Uncle Daniel telling the immortal tales which Uncle Remus Harris was to gather into his books and charm the world with by and by. And I can feel again the creepy joy which quivered through me when the time for the ghost story of the golden arm was reached, and the sense of regret, too, which came over me, for it was always the last story of the evening, and there was nothing between it and the unwelcome bed. I can remember the bare wooden stairway in my uncle's house, and the turn to the left above the landing, and the rafters and the slanting roof over my head, and the square of moonlight on the floor, and the white, cold world of snow outside, seen through the curtainless window. I can remember the howling of the wind and the quaking of the house on stormy nights, and how snug and cozy one felt under the blankets, listening, and how powdery snow used to sift in around the sashes and lie in little ridges on the floor and make the place look chilly in the morning and curb the wild desire to get up in case there was any. I can remember how very dark that room was in the dark of the moon, and how packed it was with ghostly stillness when one woke up by accident away in the night, and forgotten sins came flocking out of the secret chambers of the memory and wanted a hearing, and how ill chosen the time seemed for this kind of business, and how dismal was the hoo-hooing of the owl and the wailing of the wolf, sent mourning by on the night wind. I remember the raging of the rain on that roof, summer nights, and how pleasant it was to lie and listen to it, and enjoy the white splendor of the lightning and the majestic booming and crashing of the thunder. It was a very satisfactory room, and there was a lightning rod which was reachable from the window, an adorable and skittish thing to climb up and down summer nights when there were duties on hand of a sort to make privacy desirable. I remember the coon and possum hunts, nights with the Negroes, and the long marches through the black gloom of the woods, and the excitement which fired everybody when the distant bay of an inexperienced dog announced that the game was treed. Then the wild scramblings and stumblings through briars and bushes and over roots to get to the spot. Then the lighting of a fire and the felling of a tree. The joyful frenzy of the dogs and the Negroes, and the weird picture it all made in the red glare. I remember it all well, and the delight that everyone got out of it, except the coon. I remember the pigeon seasons when the birds would come in millions and cover the trees, and by their weight break down the branches. They were clubbed to death with sticks. Guns were not necessary and were not used. I remember the squirrel hunts and the prairie chicken hunts and the wild turkey hunts and all that, and how we turned out mornings while it was still dark to go on these expeditions, and how chilly and dismal it was, and how often I regretted that I was well enough to go. A toot on a tin horn brought twice as many dogs as were needed, and in their happiness they raced and scampered about and knocked small people down and made no end of unnecessary noise. At the word, they vanished away toward the woods, and we drifted silently after them in the melancholy gloom. But presently the gray dawn stole over the world. The birds piped up. Then the sun rose and poured light and comfort all around. Everything was fresh and dewy and fragrant, and life was a boon again. After 3 hours of tramping, we arrived back wholesomely tired, overladen with game, very hungry, and just in time for breakfast. Dictated Thursday, December 6th, 1906. From Susie's Biography of Me. February 27, Sunday. Clara's reputation as a baby was always a fine one. Mine exactly the contrary. Often one related story concerning her braveness as a baby and her own opinion of this quality of hers is this. Clara and I often got slivers in our hands, and when Mamma took them out with a much dreaded needle, Clara was always very brave, and I very cowardly. One day, Clara got one of these slivers in her hand, a very bad one, and while Mamma was taking it out, Clara stood perfectly still without even wincing. I saw how brave she was, and turning to Mamma said, "Mamma, isn't she a brave little thing?" Presently, Mamma had to give the little hand quite a dig with the needle, and noticing how perfectly quiet Clara was about it, she exclaimed, "Why, Clara, you are a brave little thing." Clara responded, "Nobody's braver but God." Clara's pious remark is the main detail, and Susie has accurately remembered its phrasing. The 3-year-older's wound was of a formidable sort, and not one which the mother's surgery would have been equal to. The flesh of the finger had been burst by a cruel accident. It was the doctor that sewed it up, and to all appearances it was he, and the other independent witnesses, that did the main part of the suffering. Each stitch that he took made Clara wince slightly, but it shriveled the others. I take pride in Clara's remark because it shows that although she was only 3 years old, her fireside teachings were already making her a thinker and also an observer of proportions. I am not claiming any credit for this. I furnished to the children worldly knowledge and wisdom, but was not competent to go higher, and so I left their spiritual education in the hands of the mother. A result of this modesty of mine was made manifest to me in a very striking way some years afterward, when Jean was 9 years old. We had recently arrived in Berlin at the time and had begun housekeeping in a furnished apartment. One morning at breakfast a vast card arrived, an invitation to be precise. It was a command from the Emperor of Germany to come to dinner. During several months I had encountered socially on the continent men bearing lofty titles, and all this while Jean was becoming more and more impressed and awed and subdued by these imposing events, for she had not been abroad before, and they were new to her, wonders out of dreamland turned into realities. The imperial card was passed from hand to hand around the table, and examined with interest. When it reached Jean, she exhibited excitement and emotion, but for a time was quite speechless. Then she said, "Why, Papa, if it keeps going on like this, pretty soon there won't be anybody left for you to get acquainted with but God." It was not complimentary to think that I was not acquainted in that quarter, but she was young, and the young jump to conclusions without reflection. Necessarily, I did myself the honor to obey the command of the Emperor Wilhelm II, Prince Heinrich, and 6 or 8 other guests were present. The Emperor did most of the talking, and he talked well and in faultless English. In both of these conspicuousnesses I was gratified to recognize a resemblance to myself, a very apt resemblance, no, almost exact, but not quite, a modified exactness with the advantage in the favor of the Emperor. My English, like his, is nearly faultless. Like him, I talk well, and when I have guests at dinner, I prefer to do all the talking myself. It is the best way and the pleasantest, also the most profitable for the others. I was greatly pleased to perceive that His Majesty was familiar with my books, and that his attitude toward them was not uncomplimentary. In the course of his talk, he said that my best and most valuable book was Old Times on the Mississippi. I will refer to that remark again presently. An official who was well up in the Foreign Office at that time, and had served under Bismarck for 14 years, was still occupying his old place under Chancellor Caprivi. Smith, I will call him, of whom I am speaking, though that is not his name. He was a special friend of mine, and I greatly enjoyed his society, although in order to have it, it was necessary for me to seek it as late as midnight, and not earlier. This was because government officials of his rank had to work all day after 9 in the morning, and then attend official banquets in the evening, wherefore they were usually unable to get life-restoring fresh air and exercise for their jaded minds and bodies earlier than midnight. Then they turned out in groups of 2 or 3 and gratefully and violently tramped the deserted streets until 2 in the morning. Smith had been in the government service, at home and abroad, for more than 30 years, and he was now 6 years old, or close upon it. He could not remember a year in which he had had a vacation for more than a fortnight's length. He was weary all through to the bones and the marrow now, and was yearning for a holiday of a whole 3 months. Yearning so longingly and so poignantly that he had at last made up his mind to make a desperate cast for it and stand the consequences, whatever they might be. It was against all rules to ask for a vacation, quite against all etiquette. The shock of it would paralyze the chancellery. Stem etiquette and usage required another form. The applicant was not privileged to ask for a vacation. He must send in his resignation. The chancellor would know that the applicant was not really trying to resign, and didn't want to resign, but was merely trying to get in this left-handed way, to get a vacation. The night before the Emperor's dinner, I helped Smith take his exercise after midnight, and he was full of his project. He had sent in his resignation that day, and was trembling for the result, and naturally, because it might possibly be that the Chancellor would be happy to fill his place with somebody else, in which case he could accept the resignation without comment and without offense. Smith was in a very anxious frame of mind. Not that he feared that Caprivi was dissatisfied with him, for he had no such fear. It was the Emperor that he was afraid of. He did not know how he stood with the Emperor. He said that while apparently it was Caprivi who would decide the case, it was in reality the Emperor who would perform that service. That the Emperor kept personal watch upon everything, and that no official sparrow could fall to the ground without his privity and consent. That the resignation would be laid before His Majesty, who would accept it or decline to accept it according to his pleasure. And that then his pleasure in the matter would be communicated by Caprivi. Smith said he would know his fate the next evening, after the imperial dinner that when I should escort His Majesty into the large salon contiguous to the dining room, I would find there about 30 men, cabinet members, admirals, generals, and other great officials of the empire, and that these men would be standing talking together in little separate groups of 2 or 3 persons, that the emperor would move from group to group and say a word to each, sometimes 2 words, sometimes 10 words, and that the length of his speech, whether brief or not so brief, would indicate the exact standing in the emperor's regard of the man accosted, and that by observing this thermometer an expert could tell, to half a degree, the state of the imperial weather in each case, that in Berlin, as in the imperial days of Rome, the emperor was the sun, and that his smile or his frown meant good fortune or disaster to the man upon whom it should fall. Smith suggested that I watch the thermometer while the emperor went his rounds of the groups, and added that if His Majesty talked 4 minutes with any person there present, it meant high favor, and the sun was in the zenith, and cloudless for that man. I mentally recorded that 4-minute altitude, and resolved to see if any man there on that night stood in sufficient favor to achieve it. Very well. After the dinner, I watched the emperor while he passed from group to group, and privately I timed him with a watch. 2 or 3 times he came near to reaching the 4-minute altitude, but always he fell a little short. The last man he came to was Smith. He put his hand on Smith's shoulder and began to talk to him, and when he finished, the thermometer had scored 7 minutes. The company then moved toward the smoking room, where cigars, beer, and anecdotes would be in brisk service until midnight. And as Smith passed me, he whispered, "That settles it. The Chancellor will ask me how much of a vacation I want, and I shan't be afraid to raise the limit. I shall call for 6 months." Smith's dream had been to spend his 3 months' vacation, in case he got a vacation instead of the other thing, in one of the great capitals of the continent, a capital whose name I shall suppress at present. The next day the Chancellor asked him how much of a vacation he wanted and where he desired to spend it. Smith told him. His prayer was granted, and rather more than granted. The Chancellor augmented his salary and attached him to the German embassy of that selected capital, giving him a place of high dignity bearing an imposing title, and with nothing to do except attend banquets of an extraordinary character at the embassy, once or twice a year. The term of his vacation was not specified. He was to continue it until requested to come back to his work in the Foreign Office. This was in 1891. 8 years later, Smith was passing through Vienna, and he called upon me. There had been no interruption of his vacation as yet, and there was no likelihood that an interruption of it would occur while he should still be among the living. Dictated Monday, December 17th, 1906. As I have already remarked, old times on the Mississippi got the Kaiser's best praise. It was after midnight when I reached home. I was usually out until toward midnight, and the pleasure of being out late was poisoned every night by the dread of what I must meet at my front door. An indignant face, a resentful face, the face of the portier. The portier was a tow-headed young German, 22 or 3 years old, and it had been for some time apparent to me that he did not enjoy being hammered out of his sleep nights to let me in. He never had a kind word for me, nor a pleasant look. I couldn't understand it, since it was his business to be on watch and let the occupants of several flats in and at any and all hours of the night. I could not see why he so distinctly failed to get reconciled to it. The fact is, I was ignorantly violating, every night, a custom in which he was commercially interested. I did not suspect this. No one had told me of the custom, and if I had been left to guess it, it would have taken me a very long time to make a success of it. It was a custom which was so well established and so universally recognized that it had all the force and dignity of law. By authority of this custom, whoever entered a Berlin house after 10 at night must pay a trifling toll to the portier for breaking his sleep to let him in. This tax was either 2.5 cents or 5 cents, I don't remember which, but I had never paid it and didn't know I owed it, and as I had been residing in Berlin several weeks, I was so far in arrears that my presence in the German capital was getting to be a serious disaster to that young fellow. I arrived from the imperial dinner sorrowful and anxious, made my presence known, and prepared myself to wait in patience the tedious minute or two which the portier usually allowed himself to keep me tarrying as a punishment. But this time there was no stage wait. The door was instantly unlocked, unbolted, unchained, and flung wide, and in it appeared the strange and welcome apparition of the portier's round face, all sunshine and smiles and welcome, in place of the black frowns and hostility that I was expecting. Plainly, he had not come out of his bed. He had been waiting for me, watching for me. He began to pour out upon me in the most enthusiastic and energetic way a generous stream of German welcome and homage, meanwhile dragging me excitedly to his small bedroom beside the front door. There he made me bend down over a row of German translations of my books and said, "There, you wrote them. I found it out. By God, I did not know it before, and I ask 1,000,000 pardons. That one there, The Old Times on the Mississippi, is the best book you ever wrote." The usual number of those curious accidents which we call coincidences have fallen to my share in this life, but for picturesqueness, this one puts all the others in the shade. That a crowned head and a portiere, the very top of an empire and the very bottom of it, should pass the very same criticism and deliver the very same verdict upon a book of mine, and almost in the same hour and the same breath, is a coincidence which out-coincidences any coincidence which I could have imagined with such powers of imagination as I have been favored with, and I have not been accustomed to regard them as being small or of an inferior quality. It is always a satisfaction to me to remember that whereas I do not know for sure what any other nation thinks of one of my 23 volumes, I do at least know for a certainty what one nation of 50 millions thinks of one of them, at any rate. For if the mutual verdict of the top of an empire and the bottom of it does not establish for good and all the judgment of the entire nation concerning that book, then the axiom that we can get a sure estimate of a thing by arriving at a general average of all the opinions involved is a fallacy. Dictated Monday, February 10, 1907. 2 months ago, December 6th, I was dictating a brief account of a private dinner in Berlin, where the Emperor of Germany was host and I the chief guest. Something happened the day before yesterday, which moves me to take up that matter again. At the dinner, His Majesty chatted briskly and entertainingly along in an easy and flowing English, and now and then he interrupted himself to address a remark to me or to some other individual of the guests. When the reply had been delivered, he resumed his talk. I noticed that the table etiquette tallied with that which was the law of my house at home when we had guests. That is to say, the guests answered when the host favored them with a remark, and then quieted down and behaved themselves until they got another chance. If I had been in the emperor's chair and he in mine, I should have felt infinitely comfortable and at home, and should have done a world of talking, and done it well, but I was guest now, and consequently I felt less at home. From old experience, I was familiar with the rules of the game, and familiar with their exercise from the high place of host, but I was not familiar with the trammeled and less satisfactory position of a guest. Therefore, I felt a little strange and out of place. But there was no animosity. No, the emperor was host, therefore, according to my own rule, he had a right to do the talking, and it was my honorable duty to intrude no interruptions or other improvements, except upon invitation. And of course it could be my turn someday on some friendly visit of inspection to America. It might be my pleasure and distinction to have him as guest at my table. Then I would give him a rest and a remarkably quiet time. In one way, there was a difference between his table and mine. For instance, atmosphere. The guests stood in awe of him, and naturally they conferred that feeling upon me, for, after all, I am only human, although I regret it. When a guest answered a question, he did it with deferential voice and manner. He did not put any emotion into it, and he did not spin it out, but got it out of his system as quickly as he could, and then looked relieved. The emperor was used to this atmosphere, and it did not chill his blood. Maybe it was an inspiration to him, for he was alert, brilliant, and full of animation. Also, he was most gracefully and felicitously complimentary to my books, and I will remark here that the happy phrasing of a compliment is one of the rarest of human gifts, and the happy delivery of it another. In that other chapter I mentioned the high compliment which he paid to the book Old Times on the Mississippi, but there were others, among them some gratifying praise of my description in A Tramp Abroad, of certain striking phases of German student life. I mention these things here because I shall have occasion to hark back to them presently. Dictated Tuesday, February 12, 1907. Those stars indicate the long chapter which I dictated yesterday. A chapter which is much too long for magazine purposes, and therefore must wait until this autobiography shall appear in book form 5 years hence, when I am dead. 5 years according to my calculation. 27 years according to the prediction furnished me a week ago by the latest and most confident of all the palmists who have ever read my fortune in my hand. The Emperor's dinner and its beer and anecdote appendix covered 6 hours of diligent industry, and this accounts for the extraordinary length in that chapter. A couple of days ago, a gentleman called upon me with a message. He had just arrived from Berlin, where he had been acting for our government in a matter concerning tariff revision. He being a member of the commission appointed by our government to conduct our share of the affair. Upon the completion of the commission's labors, the Emperor invited the members of it to an audience, and in the course of the conversation he made a reference to me. Continuing, he spoke of my chapter on the German language in A Tramp Abroad, and characterized it by an adjective which is too complimentary for me to repeat here without bringing my modesty under suspicion. Then he paid some compliments to The Innocents Abroad, and followed these with the remark that my account in one of my books of certain striking phases of German student life was the best and truest that had ever been written. By this I perceive that he remembers that dinner of 16 years ago, for he said the same thing to me about the student chapter at that time. Next, he said he wished this gentleman to convey 2 messages to America from him, and delivered them, one to the President, the other to me. The wording of the message to me was, "Convey to Mr. Clemens my kindest regards. Ask him if he remembers that dinner, and ask him why he didn't do any talking." Why, how could I talk when he was talking? He held the age, as the poker clergy would say, and 2 can't talk at the same time with good effect. It reminds me of the man who was reproached by a friend who said, "I think it a shame that you have not spoken to your wife for 15 years. How do you explain it? How do you justify it?" The poor man said, "I didn't want to interrupt her." If the Emperor had been at my table, he would not have suffered from my silence. He would only have suffered from the sorrows of his own solitude. If I were not too old to travel, I would go to Berlin and introduce the etiquette of my own table, which tallies with the etiquette observable at other royal tables. I would say, "Invite me again, Your Majesty, and give me a chance." Then I would courteously waive rank and do all the talking myself. I thank His Majesty for his kind message and am proud to have it and glad to express my sincere reciprocation of its sentiments. Dictated January 17, 1906. Reverend Joseph T. Harris and I have been visiting General Sickles. Once, 20 or 25 years ago, just as Harris was coming out of his gate Sunday morning to walk to his church and preach, a telegram was put into his hand. He read it immediately, and then, in a manner, collapsed. It said, "General Sickles died last night at midnight." He had been a chaplain under Sickles through the war. It wasn't so, but no matter. It was so to Harris at the time. He walked to the church, but his mind was far away. All his affection and homage and worship of his general had come to the fore. His heart was full of these emotions. He hardly knew where he was. In his pulpit, he stood up and began the service, but with a voice over which he had almost no command. The congregation had never seen him thus moved before in his pulpit. They sat there and gazed at him and wondered what was the matter, because he was now reading, in this broken voice and with occasional tears trickling down his face, what to them seemed a quite unemotional chapter. That one about Moses begat Aaron, and Aaron begat Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy begat St. Peter, and St. Peter begat Cain, and Cain begat Abel. And he was going along with this and half crying, his voice continually breaking. The congregation left the church that morning without being able to account for this most extraordinary thing, as it seemed to them, that a man who had been a soldier for more than 4 years, and who had preached in that pulpit so many, many times on really moving subjects, without even the quiver of a lip, should break all down over the begats. They couldn't understand, but there it is. Anyone can see how such a mystery as that would arouse the curiosity of those people to the boiling point. Harris has had many adventures. He has had more adventures in a year than anybody else has in 5. One Saturday night he noticed a bottle on his uncle's dressing bureau. He thought the label said, "Hair Restorer," and he took it in his room and gave his head a good drenching and sousing with it, and carried it back and thought no more about it. Next morning when he got up, his head was a bright green. He sent around everywhere and couldn't get a substitute preacher, so he had to go to his church himself and preach, and he did it. He hadn't a sermon in his barrel, as it happened, of any lightsome character, so he had to preach a very grave one, a very serious one, and it made the matter worse. The gravity of the sermon did not harmonize with the gaiety of his head, and the people sat all through it with handkerchiefs stuffed in their mouths to try to keep down their joy. And Harris told me that he was sure he never had seen his congregation, the whole body of his congregation, the entire body of his congregation, absorbed in interest in his sermon, from beginning to end, before. Always there had been an aspect of indifference, here and there, or wandering somewhere, but this time there was nothing of the kind. Those people sat there as if they thought, "Good, for this day and train only, we must have all there is of this show, not waste any of it." And he said that when he came down out of the pulpit, more people waited to shake him by the hand and tell him what a good sermon it was than ever before. And it seemed a pity that these people should do these fictions in such a place, right in the church, when it was quite plain they were not interested in the sermon at all. They only wanted to get a near view of his head. Well, Harris said, no, Harris didn't say, I say, that as the days went on and Sunday followed Sunday, the interest in Harris's hair grew and grew, because it didn't stay merely and monotonously green. It took on deeper and deeper shades of green, and then it would change and become reddish, and would go from that to some other color, purplish, yellowish, bluish, and so on. But it was never a solid color. It was always mottled, and each Sunday it was a little more interested than it was the Sunday before, and Harris's head became famous, and people came from New York and Boston and South California and Japan and so on to look. There wasn't seating capacity for all the people that came while his head was undergoing these various and fascinating modelings, and it was a good thing in several ways because the business had been languishing a little, and now a lot of people joined the church so that they could have the show, and it was the beginning of a prosperity for that church which has never diminished in all these years. Dictated October 8th, 1906. From Susie's Biography of Me. Papa says that if the cholera comes here, he will take Sour Mash to the mountains. This remark about the cat is followed by various entries covering a month in which Jean, General Grant, the sculptor Gerhard, Mrs. Candace Wheeler, Miss Dora Wheeler, Mr. Frank Stockton, Mrs. Mary Mapes Dodge, and the widow of General Custer appear and drift in procession across the page, then vanish forever from the biography. Then Susie drops this remark in the wake of the vanished procession. Sour Mash is a constant source of anxiety, care, and pleasure to Papa. I did, in truth, think a great deal of that old tortoise-shell harlot, but I haven't a doubt that in order to impress Susie I was pretending agonies of solicitude which I didn't honestly feel. Sour Mash never gave me any real anxiety. She was always able to take care of herself, and she was ostentatiously vain of the fact. Vain of it to a degree which often made me ashamed of her, much as I esteemed her. Many persons would like to have the society of cats during the summer vacation in the country, but they deny themselves this pleasure because they think they must either take the cats along when they return to the city, where there would be a trouble and an encumbrance, or leave them in the country, houseless and homeless. These people have no ingenuity, no invention, no wisdom, or it would occur to them to do as I do, rent cats by the month for the summer, and return them to their good homes at the end of it. Early last May, I rented a kitten of a farmer's wife by the month. Then I got a discount by taking 3. They have been good company for about 5 months now, and are still kittens. At least they have not grown much, and to all intents and purposes they are still kittens, and as full of romping energy and enthusiasm as they were in the beginning. This is remarkable. I am an expert in cats, but I have not seen a kitten keep its kittenhood nearly so long before. These are beautiful creatures, these triplets. 2 of them wear the blackest and shiniest and thickest of sealskin vestments, all over their bodies except the lower half of their faces and the terminations of their paws. The black masks reach down below the eyes. Therefore, when the eyes are closed, they are not visible. The rest of the face and the gloves and stockings are snow white. These markings are just the same on both cats. So exactly the same that when you call one, the other is likely to answer, because they cannot tell each other apart. Since the cats are precisely alike and can't be told apart by any of us, they do not need 2 names, so they have but one between them. We call both of them Sackcloth, and we call the gray one Ashes. I believe I have never seen such intelligent cats as these before. They are full of the nicest discriminations. When I read German aloud, they weep. You can see the tears run down. It shows what pathos there is in the German tongue. I had not noticed before that all German is pathetic, no matter what the subject or how it is treated. It was these humble observers that brought the knowledge to me. I have tried all kinds of Germans on these cats. Romance, poetry, philosophy, theology, market reports, and the result has always been the same. The cats sob and let the tears run down, which shows that all German is pathetic. French is not a familiar tongue to me, and the pronunciation is difficult and comes out of me encumbered with a Missouri accent. But the cats like it, and when I make impassioned speeches in that language, they sit in a row and put up their paws, palm to palm, and frantically give thanks. Hardly any cats are affected by music, but these are. When I sing, they go reverently away, showing how deeply they feel it. Sour Mash never cared for these things. She had many noble qualities, but at the bottom she was not refined, and cared little or nothing for theology and the arts. It is a pity to say it, but these cats are not above the grade of human beings, for I know by certain signs that they are not sincere in their exhibitions of emotion, but exhibit them merely to show off and attract attention, conduct which is distinctly human, yet with a difference. They do not know enough to conceal their desire to show off, but the grown human being does. What is ambition? It is only the desire to be conspicuous. The desire for fame is only the desire to be continuously conspicuous and attract attention and be talked about. These cats are like human beings in another way. When Ashes began to work his fictitious emotions and show off, the other members of the firm followed suit in order to be in the fashion. That is the way with human beings. They are afraid to be outside. Whatever the fashion happens to be, they conform to it, whether it be a pleasant fashion or the reverse, they lacking the courage to ignore it and go their own way. All human beings would like to dress in loose and comfortable and highly colored and showy garments, and they had their desire until a century ago, when a king or some other influential ass introduced somber hues and discomfort and ugly designs into masculine clothing. The meek public surrendered to the outrage, and by consequence we are in that odious captivity today, and are likely to remain in it for a long time to come. Fortunately, the women were not included in the disaster, and so their graces and their beauty still have the enhancing help of delicate fabrics and varied and beautiful colors. Their clothing makes a great opera audience for an enchanting spectacle, a delight to the eye and the spirit, a Garden of Eden for charm and color. The men, clothed in dismal black, are scattered here and there and everywhere over the garden, like so many charred stumps, and they damage the effect, but cannot annihilate it. In summer, we poor creatures have a respite, and may clothe ourselves in white garments, loose, soft, and in some degree shapely. But in the winter, the somber winter, the depressing winter, the cheerless winter, when white clothes and bright colors are especially needed to brighten our spirits and lift them up, we all conform to the prevailing insanity and go about in dreary black, each man doing it because the others do it, and not because he wants to. They are really no sincerer than sackcloth and ashes. At bottom, the sackcloths do not care to exhibit their emotions when I am performing before them. They only do it because Ashes started it. I would like to dress in a loose and flowing costume made all of silks and velvets, resplendent with all the stunning dyes of the rainbow, and so would every sane man I have ever known. But none of us dares to venture it. There is such a thing as carrying conspicuousness to the point of discomfort, and if I should appear on Fifth Avenue on a Sunday morning at church time, clothed as I would like to be clothed, the churches would be vacant, and I should have all the congregations tagging after me to look and secretly envy and publicly scoff. It is the way human beings are made. They are always keeping their real feelings shut up inside and publicly exploiting their fictitious ones. Next, after fine colors, I like plain white. One of my sorrows when the summer ends is that I must put off my cheery and comfortable white clothes and enter for the winter into the depressing cavity of the shapeless and degrading black ones. It is mid-October now, and the weather is growing cold up here in the New Hampshire hills, but it will not succeed in freezing me out of these white garments. For here the neighbors are few, and it is only crowds that I am afraid. I made a brave experiment the other night to see how it would feel to shock a crowd with these unseasonable clothes, and also to see how long it might take the crowd to reconcile itself to them and stop looking astonished and outraged. On a stormy evening, I made a talk before a full house in a village, clothed like a ghost, and looking as conspicuously all solitary and alone on that platform as any ghost could have looked. And I found, to my gratification, that it took the house less than 10 minutes to forget about the ghost and give its attention to the tidings I had brought. I am nearly 71, and I recognize that my age has given me a good many privileges, valuable privileges which are not granted to younger persons. Little by little, I hope to get together courage enough to wear white clothes all through the winter in New York. It will be a great satisfaction to me to show off in this way, and perhaps the largest of all satisfactions will be the knowledge that every scoffer of my sex will secretly envy me and wish he dared to follow my lead. That mention that I have acquired new and great privileges by grace of my age is not an uncalculated remark. When I passed the 70th milestone 10 months ago, I instantly realized that I had entered a new country and a new atmosphere. To all the public I was become recognizably old, undeniably old, and from that moment everybody assumed a new attitude towards me. The reverent attitude granted by custom to age, and straightway the stream of generous new privileges began to flow in upon me and refresh my life. Since then I have lived an ideal existence, and now I believe what Choate said last March, and which at the time I didn't credit, that the best of life begins at 70, for then your work is done. You know that you have done your best, let the quality of the work be what it may, that you have earned your holiday, a holiday of peace and contentment, and that thenceforth, to the setting of your sun, nothing will break it, nothing will interrupt it. Dictated January 22, 1907. In an earlier chapter, I inserted some verses beginning, "Love came at dawn," which had been found among Susie's papers after her death. I was not able to say that they were hers, but I judged that they might be, for the reason that she had not enclosed them in quotation marks according to her habit when storing up treasures gathered from other people. Stedman was not able to determine the authorship for me, as the verses were new to him, but the authorship has now been traced. The verses were written by William Wilford Campbell, a Canadian poet, and they form a part of the contents of his book called Beyond the Hills of Dream. The authorship of the beautiful lines which my wife and I inscribed upon Susie's gravestone was untraceable for a time. We had found them in a book in India, but had lost the book with it and with it the author's name. But in time an application to the editor of Notes and Queries furnished me the author's name, and it has been added to the verses upon the gravestone. Last night, at a dinner party where I was present, Mr. Peter Dunn Dooley handed to the host several dollars in satisfaction of a lost bet. I seemed to see an opportunity to better my condition, and I invited Dooley, apparently disinterestedly, to come to my house Friday and play billiards. He accepted, and I judged that there is going to be a deficit in the Dooley treasury as a result. In great qualities of the heart and brain, Dooley is gifted beyond all propriety. He is brilliant. He is an expert with his pen, and he easily stands at the head of all the satirists of his generation. But he is going to walk in darkness Friday afternoon, It will be a fraternal kindness to teach him that with all his light and culture, he does not know all the valuable things, and it will also be a fraternal kindness to him to complete his education for him, and I shall do this on Friday and send him home in that perfected condition. I possess a billiard secret which can be valuable to the Dooley sept, after I shall have conferred it upon Dooley for a consideration. It is a discovery which I made by accident 38 years ago in my father-in-law's house in Elmira. There was a scarred and battered and ancient billiard table in the garret, along with it a peck of checked and chipped balls and a rack full of crooked and headless cues. I played solitaire up there every day with that difficult outfit. The table was not level, but slanted sharply to the southeast. There wasn't a ball that was round or would complete the journey you started it on, but would always get tired and stop halfway and settle with a jolty wobble to a standstill on its chipped side. I tried making counts with 4 balls, but found it difficult and discouraging, so I added a 5th ball, then a 6th, then a 7th, and kept on adding until at last I had 12 balls on the table and a 13th to play with. My game was caroms solely, caroms plain or caroms with cushions to help, anything that could furnish a count. In the course of time, I found to my astonishment that I was never able to run 15 under any circumstances. By huddling the balls advantageously in the beginning, I could now and then coax 14 out of them, but I couldn't reach 15 by either luck or skill. Sometimes the balls would get scattered into difficult positions and defeat me in that way. Sometimes, if I managed to keep them together, I would freeze, and always when I froze and had to play away from the contact, there was sure to be nothing to play at but a wide and uninhabited vacancy. One day, Mr. Dalton called on my brother-in-law on a matter of business, and I was asked if I could entertain him a while until my brother-in-law should finish an engagement with another gentleman. I said I could and took him up to the billiard table. I had played with him many times at the club and knew that he could play billiards tolerably well. Only tolerably well, but not any better than I could. He and I were just a match. He didn't know our table. He didn't know those balls. He didn't know those warped and headless cues. He didn't know the southeastern slant of the table and how to allow for it. I judged it would be safe and profitable to offer him a bet on my scheme. I emptied the avalanche of 13 balls on the table and said, "Take a ball and begin, Mr. Dalton. How many can you run with an outlay like that?" He said, with the half-affronted air of a mathematician who has been asked how much of the multiplication table he can recite without a break. "I suppose 1,800,000 anyway." I said, "You shall have the privilege of placing the balls to suit yourself, and I want to bet you $1 that you can't run 15. I will not dwell upon the sequel. At the end of an hour, his face was red and wet with perspiration. His outer garments lay scattered here and there over the place. He was the angriest man in the state, and there wasn't a rag or remnant of an injurious adjective left in him anywhere, and I had all his small change. When the summer was over, we went home to Hartford, and one day Mr. George Robertson arrived from Boston with 2 or 3 hours to spare between then and the return train. And he was a young gentleman to whom we were in debt for much social pleasure. It was my duty, and a welcome duty, to make his 2 or 3 hours interesting for him. So I took him upstairs and set up my billiard scheme for his comfort. Mine was a good table, in perfect repair. The cues were in perfect condition, the balls were ivory and flawless, but I knew that Mr. Robertson was my prey just the same, for by exhaustive tests with this outfit, I had found that my limit was 31. I had proved to my satisfaction that whereas I could not fairly expect to get more than 6 or 8 or a dozen caroms out of a run, I could now and then reach 20 and 25. And after a long procession of failures, finally achieve a run of 31. but in no case had I ever got beyond 31. Robertson's game, as I knew, was a little better than mine, so I resolved to require him to make 32. I believed it would entertain him. He was one of these brisk and hearty and cheery and self-satisfied young fellows who are brimful of confidence and who plunge with grateful eagerness into any enterprise that offers a showy test of their abilities. I emptied the balls on the table and said, "Take a cue and a ball, George, and begin. How many carams do you think you can make out of that layout?" He laughed the laugh of the gay and the carefree as became his youth and inexperience and said, "I can punch carams out of that bunch a week without a break." I said, "Place the balls to suit yourself and begin." Confidence is a necessary thing in billiards, but overconfidence is bad. George went at his task with too much lightsomeness of spirit and disrespect for the situation. On his first shot he scored 3 carams. On his second shot he scored 4 carams, and on his third shot he missed as simple a caram as could be devised. He was very much astonished, and said he would not have supposed that careful play could be needed with an acre of bunched balls in front of a person. He began again and played more carefully, but still with too much lightsomeness. He couldn't seem to learn to take the situation seriously. He made about a dozen carams and broke down. He was irritated with himself now, and he thought he caught me laughing. He didn't. I do not laugh publicly at my client when his game is going on. I only do it inside, or save it for after the exhibition is over. But he thought he had caught me laughing, and it increased his irritation. Of course, I knew he thought I was laughing privately, for I was experienced. They all think that, and it has a good effect. It sharpens their annoyance and debilitates their play. He made another trial and failed. Once more he was astonished. Once more he was humiliated, and as for his anger, it rose to summer heat. He arranged the balls again, grouping them carefully, and said he would win this time or die. When a client reaches this condition, it is a good time to damage his nerve further, and this can always be done by saying some little mocking thing or other that has the outside appearance of a friendly remark. So I employed this art. I suggested that a bet might tauten his nerves, and that I would offer one, but that as I did not want it to be an expense to him, but only a help, I would make it small, a cigar if he were willing, a cigar that he would fail again, not an expensive one, but a cheap native one, of the crown jewel breed, such as is manufactured in Hartford for the clergy. It set him afire all over. I could see the blue flame issue from his eyes. He said, "Make it 100, and no Connecticut cabbage leaf product, but Havana, $25 the box." I took him up, but said I was sorry to see him do this, because it did not seem to me right or fair for me to rob him under our own roof, when he had been so kind to us. He said, with energy and acrimony, "You take care of your own pocket, if you'll be so good, and leave me to take care of mine." And he plunged at the Congress of Balls with a vindictiveness which was infinitely contenting to me. He scored a failure, and began to undress. I knew it would come to that, for he was in the condition now that Mr. Dooley will be in at about that stage of the contest on Friday afternoon. A clothes rack will be provided for Mr. Dooley to hang his things on as fast as he shall from time to time shed them. George raised his voice 4 degrees and flung out the challenge. "Double or quits!" "Done," I responded in the gentle and compassionate voice of one who is apparently getting sorrier and sorrier. There was an hour and a half of straight disaster after that, and if it was a sin to enjoy it, it is no matter. I did enjoy it. It is half a lifetime ago, but I enjoy it yet. Every time I think of it, George made failure after failure. His fury increased with each failure as he scored it. With each defeat he flung off one or another rag of his raiment, and every time he started on a fresh inning, he made it double or quits once more. Twice he reached 30 and broke down. Once he reached 31 and broke down. These nears made him frantic, and I believe I was never so happy in my life except the time, a few years later, when the Reverend J. H. Twitchell and I walked to Boston, and he had the celebrated conversation with the hostler at the inn at Ashford, Connecticut. At last, when we were notified that Patrick was at the door to drive him to his train, George owed me 5,000 cigars at 25 cents apiece, and I was so sorry I could have hugged him, but he shouted, "Give me 10 minutes more," and added stormily, "It's double or quits again, and I'll win out free of debt or owe you 10,000 cigars, and you'll pay the funeral expenses." He began on his final effort, and I believe that in all my experience among both amateurs and experts, I have never seen a cue so carefully handled in my lifetime as George handled his upon this intensely interesting occasion. He got safely up to 25 and then ceased to breathe. So did I. He labored along and added a point, another point, still another point, and finally reached 31. He stopped there, and we took a breath. By this time, the balls were scattered all down the cushions, about a foot or two apart, and there wasn't a shot in sight anywhere that any man might hope to make. In a burst of anger and confessed defeat, he sent his ball flying around the table at random, and it crotched a ball that was packed against the cushion and sprang across to a ball against the bank on the opposite side, and counted. His luck had set him free, and he didn't owe me anything. He had used up all his spare time, but we carried his clothes to the carriage, and he dressed on his way to the station, greatly wondered and admired by the ladies as he drove along. But he got his train. I am very fond of Mr. Dooley, and shall await his coming with affectionate and pecuniary interest. P.S. Saturday. He has been here. Let us not talk about it.